Happy Thursday, everybody. Once upon a time, I was starting to be a priest. I'm not starting to be a priest anymore. This is the story of how I left the priest school in 4 parts because it's a long story. I made myself coffee. Alright, so part 1 is me entering into discernment. Once upon a time, I was in priest school, right? And sometimes in the school where we were studying to be priests, we would pray. So this one Sunday morning, I'm praying, and praying is really hard. This morning, I was just distracted. I was daydreaming, of all things, about what it would be like to go back home. You know, like I'd get to see my friends again, I'd have more time to play video games, but then I caught myself and I said, wait a minute, Peter, you're supposed to be praying right now. And further, I said to myself, Peter, you don't need to be daydreaming about going home. You're in it for the priesthood. And even further, I said to myself, besides, you'd feel super guilty if you went back home. Wait a minute. Wait. Whoa. Red flag. Am I really just here studying to be a priest because I would feel guilty if I went back home? That's a terrible reason. And it was so frustrating to think that, especially because I had just been through a chapter in my spiritual life where I was especially focusing on trying to have good purity of intention. Like I was trying to be better about making sure I was doing things for the right reason and not just out of vanity. And there was a priest that I would talk to about my spiritual life, and together I felt like I had kind of come to a point where, I can move on to something else in my spiritual life. Not that I'm perfect, but I can move on. And then this thought, I am studying to be a priest because I would feel guilty if I went back home? What? So that was very frustrating that thought went through my head, and I didn't want to deal with it. And I said, okay, maybe I might have to process that later, but for now, I just want to let that go and get back to whatever I'm praying about. So I did, and I was distracted for however much longer I was in prayer. Because that's how I usually pray. Let's be honest. Later that day, this was a Sunday in May, there was a priest who was giving us a talk about the spiritual stuff, like the gospel and things. Specifically, he was giving us a reflection on the visitation of Mary. That story where Mary visits her cousin Elizabeth. Alright, now 3 quick points of context. First, the story of the visitation in brief is Mary finds out that her cousin is pregnant, and so she goes to visit her cousin and helps her out. There's more to that story, don't worry about it. Second important piece of context, I have a word association in my mind. In this gospel passage, it talks about how Mary goes and visits the hill country of Judea, because that's where her cousin Elizabeth is. And whenever I hear the phrase hill country, I think of the place where I grew up, because I grew up in a region called the Palouse. And one of the phrases that's used when describing the Palouse is, the rolling hills of the Palouse. Poetry. So when the gospel says that Mary went to the hill country to visit her cousin Elizabeth, it sounds to me like Mary went to the rolling hills. Mary went to Moscow. Moscow's my hometown. Did I say that? I don't think I did. It's fine. Oh, thanks, Mary. You visited my hometown. It's so sweet. So whenever I heard this gospel passage, I would chuckle to myself and then move on with whatever we were talking about. Third piece of context, another word association, Nazareth. Now, in this priest school, which most people call a seminary, because that's the normal word for it, in this priest school, we would use the image of Nazareth as an image of our time in the priest school. Why? Because Nazareth is the place where Jesus was removed from the world, and he grew in wisdom before God and before man. It wasn't a time of flashy public ministry where he went out and did miracles. He just stayed home, he was with his family, and he prayed a lot, and he worked as a carpenter. So sometimes when life in the priest school gets long and tedious because, I just have more studies to do, and it's always the same, and I don't feel like I'm really doing that much, sometimes it's nice to take consolation in the idea that Jesus kind of had this time in his life too, where he grew in wisdom before God and before man. So whenever I heard the word Nazareth, I would think to myself the word seminary. Jesus was in Nazareth, growing in wisdom before God and before man. So too, I am living in the seminary, growing in wisdom, hopefully, before God and before man. So that worked all well and great until this day. Why? Because in the talk, Father started talking about how Mary left Nazareth and went to the hill country. And of course, what I heard was Mary left the seminary and went to Moscow. And then Father said, and brothers, we too need to leave our Nazareth and go to the hill country. And in my mind, it was clear as a bell. What I heard was, brothers, we need to leave the seminary and go back to Moscow. And I went, whoa, wait, hold on, slow down. That's a lot to process. I mean, I know Father's intention was not to send us all home with that spiritual talk, but gee mani, it was clear as a bell in my mind. And especially after I had just come out of praying that morning and been daydreaming and the whole guilt thing that I just mentioned, I said to myself, okay, fine. Maybe this is a sign that God is inviting me into a certain sort of rediscernment of where he's calling me in life. So I guess I'll go talk to my spiritual director about it. So fast forward a little bit, I go to his office. And you know, like, going to your spiritual director when you're in the seminary and saying, hey, I think maybe God wants me to leave. Like, it's a kind of a weird conversation to get ready to make. It's a good one if that's, you know, what you need to talk about. But it felt really weird. So I walk in there and I have a whole, like, script played out in my mind where I'm going to tell him everything that happened and why I think that I should enter into a period of rediscernment. And I walk into there and I say, Father, I think that God wants me to enter into a period of rediscernment. And then Father said, okay. And I said, okay? Wait, there's not going to be any pushback? Okay? And he said, yeah, you think God wants you to enter into a period of rediscernment? And I said, well, yeah, that is what I think because of prayer and stuff. And Father said, well, great, go for it. And so after 6 years of living in a school for people who want to be priests, that was how I started my rediscernment to think about maybe leaving. That's part one. Really threw me off that he didn't push back at all. I mean, I didn't expect him to forbid me from rediscerning my vocation, but I thought he would try to say, are you sure, Peter? Maybe you should just let it sit for a little longer. But he didn't. God bless him for that. I think that's turned out well for me, I think. All right, I'll see you next week. God bless him. Ciao. So there's a thing that's been happening recently and it's super exciting. I've been getting these views from Australia, and so I just want to give a huge shout out to Australia. Like, in the past 28 days, I have gotten more views from the good people of Australia than I have from the good people of my home state. And I know that we're comparing a country to a state, but still, that's phenomenal to me. Just a huge shout out for Australia. Thank you for being part of my life. To clarify, I can't tell exactly who watches videos, but I can get some, like, demographics of, oh, people from this state watched in this general time. And that's how I know people are watching from Australia. I don't know what city they're in, but I have a really good friend who's in Australia right now, and I think Australian viewers, if you're watching still, do you know Kayla? Isn't she great? If you know her, she's just great. She's just a great person. All right, I'll see you later. But before I go, as an American, I would like to say, Aussie, Aussie, Aussie! Oi, oi, oi!